Chapter 3 of Howard's End. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeanette Ferguson. Howard's End by Edward Morgan Forster. Chapter 3. Most complacently did Mrs. Munt rehearse her mission. Her nieces were independent young women, and it was not often that she was able to help them. Emily's daughters had never been quite like other girls. They had been left motherless when Tibby was born, when Helen was 5 and Margaret herself but 13. It was before the passing of the Deceased Wife's Sisters Bill, so Mrs. Munt could, without impropriety, offer to go and keep house at Wickham Place. But her brother-in-law, who was peculiar and a German, had referred the question to Margaret, who, with the crudity of youth, had answered, no, they could manage much better alone. 5 years later, Mr. Schlegel had died too, and Mrs. Munt had repeated her offer. Margaret, crude no longer, had been grateful and extremely nice, but the substance of her answer had been the same. I must not interfere a third time, thought Mrs. Munt. However, of course she did. She learnt, to her horror, that Margaret, now of age, was taking her money out of the old safe investments and putting it into foreign things, which always smash. Silence would have been criminal. Her own fortune was invested in home rails, and most ardently did she beg her niece to imitate her. Then we should be together, dear. Margaret, out of politeness, invested a few hundreds in the Nottingham and Derby Railway, and though the foreign things did admirably, and the Nottingham and Derby declined with the steady dignity of which only home rails are capable, Mrs. Munt never ceased to rejoice, and to say, I did manage that, at all events. When the smash comes, poor Margaret will have a nest egg to fall back upon. This year Helen came of age, and exactly the same thing happened in Helen's case. She also would shift her money out of the consols, but she, too, almost without being pressed, consecrated a fraction of it into the Nottingham and Derby Railway. So far, so good. But in social matters their aunt had accomplished nothing. Sooner or later the girls would enter on the process known as throwing themselves away. And if they delayed hitherto, it was only that they might throw themselves more vehemently in the future. They saw too many people at Wickham Place. Unshaven musicians, an actress even, German cousin, one knows what foreigners are, acquaintances picked up at continental hotels, one knows what they are too. It was interesting, and down at Swanage no one appreciated culture more than Mrs. Munt, but it was dangerous, and disaster was bound to come. How right she was, and how lucky to be on the spot when disaster came. The train sped northward, under innumerable tunnels. It was only an hour's journey, but Mrs. Munt had to raise and lower the window again and again. She passed through the South Welwyn Tunnel, saw light for a moment, and entered the North Welwyn Tunnel, of tragic fame. She traversed the immense viaduct, whose arches span untroubled meadows and the dreamy flow of the Tewin water. She skirted the parks of politicians. At times the Great North Road accompanied her, more suggestive of infinity than any railway, awakening, after a nap of 100 years, to such life as is conferred by the stench of motor cars, and to such culture as is implied by the advertisements of antibilous pills. To history, to tragedy, to the past, and to the future, Mrs. Munt remained equally indifferent, hers but to concentrate on the end of her journey, and to rescue poor Helen from this dreadful mess. The station for Howard's End was at Hilton, one of the large villages that are strung so frequently along the North Road, and that owe their size to the traffic of coaching and pre-coaching days. Being near London, it had not shared in the rural decay, and its long high street had butted out right and left into residential estates. For about a mile a series of tiled and slated houses passed before Mrs. Munt's inattentive eyes, a series broken at one point by 6 Danish tumuli that stood shoulder to shoulder along the high road, tombs of soldiers. Beyond these tumuli habitations thickened, and the train came to a standstill in a tangle that was almost a town. The station, like the scenery, like Helen's letters, struck an indeterminate note. Into which country will it lead, England or suburbia? It was new, it had island platforms and a subway, and the superficial comfort exacted by businessmen, but it held hints of local life, personal intercourse, as even Mrs. Munt was to discover. "I want a house," she confided to the ticket boy. "Its name is Howard's Lodge. Do you know where it is?" "Mr. Wilcox!" the boy called. A young man in front of them turned around. "She's wanting Howard's End." There was nothing for it but to go forward, though Mrs. Munt was too much agitated even to stare at the stranger. But remembering that there were two brothers, she had the sense to say to him, "Excuse me asking, but are you the younger Mr. Wilcox or the elder?" "The younger." "Can I do anything for you?" "Oh, well," she controlled herself with difficulty. "Really, are you? She moved away from the ticket boy and lowered her voice. "I'm Miss Schlegel's aunt. I ought to introduce myself, oughtn't I? My name is Mrs. Munt." She was conscious that he raised his cap and said quite coolly, "Oh, rather. Miss Schlegel is stopping with us. Did you want to see her?" "Possibly." "I'll call you a cab. No, wait a mo," he thought. "Our motor's here. I'll run you up in it." "That is very kind." "Not at all. If you'll just wait till they bring out a parcel from the office. This way." "My niece is not with you by any chance?" "No, I came over with my father. He has gone on north in your train. You'll see Miss Schlegel at lunch. You're coming up to lunch, I hope." "I should like to come up," said Mrs. Munt, not committing herself to nourishment until she had studied Helen's lover a little more. He seemed a gentleman, but had so rattled her round that her powers of observation were numbed. She glanced at him stealthily. To a feminine eye there was nothing amiss in the sharp depressions at the corners of his mouth, nor in the rather box-like construction of his forehead. He was dark, clean-shaven, and seemed accustomed to command. "In front or behind? Which do you prefer? It may be windy in front." "In front, if I may. Then we can talk. But excuse me one moment. I can't think what they're doing with that parcel." He strode into the booking office and called with a new voice, "Hi! Hi, you there! Are you going to keep me waiting all day? Parcel for Wilcox, Howard's End. Just look sharp." Emerging, he said in quieter tones, "The station's abominably organized. If I had my way, the whole lot of 'em should get the sack. May I help you in?" "This is very good of you," said Mrs. Munt, as she settled herself into a luxurious cavern of red leather, and suffered her person to be padded with rugs and shawls. She was more civil than she had intended, but really this young man was very kind. Moreover, she was a little afraid of him. His self-possession was extraordinary. "Very good indeed," she repeated, adding, "It's just what I should have wished." "Very good of you to say so," he replied, with a slight look of surprise, which, like most slight looks, escaped Mrs. Munt's attention. "I was just tooling my father over to catch the down train. You see, we heard from Helen this morning." Young Wilcox was pouring in petrol, starting his engine, and performing other actions with which this story has no concern. The great car began to rock, and the form of Mrs. Munt, trying to explain things, sprang agreeably up and down among the red cushions. "The mater will be very glad to see you," he mumbled. "Hi, I say. Parcel for Howard's End. Bring it out. Hi!" A bearded porter emerged with the parcel in one hand and an entry book in the other. With the gathering whir of the motor, these ejaculations mingled. "Sign, must I? Why should I sign after all this bother? Not even got a pencil on you? Remember next time I report you to the station master. My time's of value, though yours mayn't be. Here being a tip." "Extremely sorry, Mrs. Munt." "Not at all, Mr. Wilcox." "And do you object to going through the village? It's rather a longer spin, but I have 1 or 2 commissions." "I should love going through the village. Naturally, I'm very anxious to talk things over with you." As she said this, she felt ashamed, for she was disobeying Margaret's instructions. Only disobeying them in the letter, surely. Margaret had only warned her against discussing the incident with outsiders. Surely it was not uncivilized or wrong to discuss it with the young man himself, since chance had thrown them together. A reticent fellow, he made no reply. Mounting by her side, he put on gloves and spectacles, and off they drove, the bearded porter, life is a mysterious business, looking after them with admiration. The wind was in their faces down the station road, blowing the dust into Mrs. Munt's eyes. But as soon as they turned into the Great North Road, she opened fire. "You can well imagine," she said, "that the news was a great shock to us." "What news?" "Mr. Wilcox," she said frankly. "Margaret has told me everything. Everything. I have seen